Good morning, Lockport. This is Dan Blasko coming to you live from the Social Studies Department. I was asked to do a close reading on a particular unit that I would discuss with my government students. Government students are typically sophomores. You'll always have a couple of juniors and maybe a handful of seniors that may not have taken the class before, but for the most part, we're talking about sophomores in high school. Now, in this particular close reading, we're going to discuss a court case that we talk about inside the judicial branch. A lot of these court cases that we do talk about when discussing this particular unit can range anywhere from state cases, federal cases, maybe even cases that get all the way to the Supreme Court. In this case, this one is relevant to high school students because it actually involves high school students that took place inside of a high school. So, this is Tinker v. Des Moines in 1969. This is a landmark case regarding one of the most prized constitutional freedoms, freedom of speech. Now, before we actually talk about freedom of speech cases, I kind of get an idea of what students realize or what they interpret as freedom of speech. And a lot of times they have no clue. They think they could say whatever they want without any consequences. By the end of the unit, they're going to know that sometimes their actions or what they say or what they do does have consequences. In this case, we're going to dissect to see what happened, to see what the verdict was, to see how high it went. So some quick background knowledge for you. This is Tinker v. Des Moines, 1969. This is at the height of the Vietnam War era. And during the Vietnam War era, there's a lot of protests going on high school campuses, college campuses, and many other different forums. This particular protest takes place on a high school campus where a group of students decided to get together and they were going to protest the Vietnam War. And how they decided to do this was simply by wearing an armband on their sleeves as a symbol of peace. Now, school officials found out about this and warned the students that if they were to wear their symbols inside the classroom, they thought it was going to be a deterrent to the educational process, that they would be promptly suspended. So the students know what the consequences were going to be, and they decided to wear the armbands anyway. When they arrived at school, they were promptly suspended. Long story short, this case goes all the way to the Supreme Court. Now, what I'm going to tell them, I'm going to show them this particular piece of paper first, which gives you the background, the constitutional issue being addressed here, but I'm not going to tell them what the Supreme Court's decision is. They basically have to tell me what they believe the Supreme Court's decision was after reading the excerpt and why. So this is what we're going to read, and as you're glancing through this in your packet, you're going to notice that there are some terms that you may not know. There's ways of how the Supreme Court justice worded things that may be confusing to some, and that's okay. That's why we're reading this a couple of times. Now, after the first reading, what I will simply ask them is a couple of questions that should be pretty basic at this time. For example, define majority opinion. They should know what that is. What is the constitutional issue being addressed here? What is an opinion? What was the verdict? After they're done reading it the first time, I'm going to ask them these series of questions. I'm going to ask them if they have any questions that I did not ask. So as they're reading it the first time, they feel free to annotate, question, dissect, whatever they want to do to make them understand what is going on in this particular case. After the second read, I'm going to go over a couple questions that might be a little bit more complicated. They're going to explain the difference between free speech and symbolic speech. After they get done reading it the first time, hopefully, but definitely by the second time, they should know that this particular court case is about symbolic speech. They have to know the difference between free speech and symbolic speech. Then, we have them compare and contrast Tinker v. Des Moines, which we just read, with a court case that we read probably a couple days before that, which also has to do with freedom of speech and freedom of expression. West Virginia v. Barnett was done in 1943. So what they're also going to understand here is what is precedent. And they're going to know by now that precedent is basically a model of past court cases that could determine a verdict on future court cases. So what happens in 1943 and 1969 could have bearing on what happens in 2015 if there was a court case that was very similar to those two. Now, after the second read, we are going to then compare Tinker v. Des Moines with free speech case regarding social media. Now, we talk about kids these days, they're on social media constantly. This is how they exercise their freedom of speech quite often. I'll then ask them what speech is protected under the First Amendment, why is certain speech protected, is online speech more or less protected than pure symbolic speech. So, I'm going to do a little compare and contrast between a case that happened in 1969 to a case that is a little bit more modern. And we're going to come up with the verdict of the modern court case, compare it to the one we just read, and figure out why these verdicts were rendered. Next, I'm going to ask them what their verdict of Tinker v. Des Moines is and why. Once they do that and we have some discussion on why they believe the Supreme Court should rule in favor of the students or why the Supreme Court should rule in favor of the school, we're going to dissect that, we're going to talk more about it, and hopefully have a very good understanding of exactly what freedom of speech is regarding this particular court case. So, when we're done with the actual third reading and they give me their verdicts, I'm going to show them this little piece where it discusses exactly what the Supreme Court decided. And this is also in your packet. In a 7-2 decision, the Supreme Court eventually rules in favor of the students, and they give an example of why they ruled in favor of the students. So then we'll discuss, was this ruling right? Why or why not? And then by that time, hopefully they understand exactly what symbolic speech is and exactly what's protected and not protected under the First Amendment of the Constitution. Hope you all learned something from this, and if you have any questions, please do not ask me. Please direct all questions to Kara and Kristen. Thank you. Hi, Schweitzer.